Ebone Darbo squinted at the tiny details of the microwave oven. His long fingers deftly wielded a screwdriver, removing the protective casing with the precision of a surgeon. The small workshop in the garage of his house on the outskirts of Little Elm always smelled of burning dust and machine oil. Here, among the disassembled toasters, irons, and coffee makers, Ebony spent most of his day fixing broken things and making a living. "This one will be ready at 4 o'clock, Mrs. Johnson," he said to an elderly customer, never taking his eyes off his work. "Come back after 4. When the door closed behind the client, Ebony leaned back in his chair and stretched. He was 29 years old, but his hands were already mottled with small tool scars, and his eyes were used to noticing the smallest details. He glanced at his watch, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He needed to meet with Lakeisha after work to go over the final details of their wedding planned for this weekend. The thought of the wedding gave him mixed feelings. On one hand, Lakeisha was beautiful, kind, and young. On the other, there was Yolanda. The phone vibrated in his pocket. Yolanda's number. Ebony looked around as if someone might be peeking, even though he was all alone in his workshop. "Hello, sweetheart." His voice changed instantly, becoming softer and deeper. "Are you coming tonight?" Yolanda's voice sounded tired, but there was still a warmth in it that was meant only for him. "Of course. I'll be at your place around 7. I'll cook your favorite ribs." Ebony smiled. Yolanda always knew how to make him feel good. Her ribs were the best in all of Little Elm. That was why her little diner, Yolanda's, was never empty, despite its unremarkable location and simple interior. They had met 3 years ago when the old oven in Yolanda's diner broke down at the worst possible time, the Friday before a rush of customers. Ebony was just starting his business then and would take any job. He showed up when called and fixed the oven in an hour. Yolanda fed him lunch in gratitude. She sat down at his table to make sure he liked the food. The conversation struck up on its own. That afternoon, Ebony noticed that despite her age, Yolanda retained a slender figure and remarkably lively eyes the color of dark amber. Her hands, calloused from work, moved with unexpected grace as she spoke of her grandchildren. Ebony was 26, she was 62. The difference of 36 years seemed insurmountable, but he began coming into the diner every week, first on the pretense of checking the oven, then just for lunch. Soon he started staying until closing time, helping Yolanda with minor repairs here and there. One evening, as he was fixing the light fixture above the bar, their hands accidentally touched. Yolanda didn't pull away. That night was the first time the two of them were alone in an empty diner until dawn. Now, 3 years later, Ebony was leading a double life. By day, a repairman, Lakeisha Mayweather's fiancé, a young man with prospects. By evening, lover of Yolanda Broden, a woman who was older than his mother. Yolanda rarely spoke of her past, but in the 3 years of their relationship, Ebony had learned enough. Her life had not been easy. She'd grown up in a poor Houston neighborhood, in a family where her father wasn't bent on raising his hand against his wife and children. At 16, she ran away from home with a boyfriend who promised her gold, but instead got her hooked on drugs and dumped her when she got pregnant. The baby was born dead. Yolanda ended up on the streets until she was taken in by an elderly woman who owned a small diner. That woman taught Yolanda how to cook and run a business. When she died 10 years later, she left the diner to Yolanda. By then, Yolanda was married to a truck driver, a rough but hard-working man. He died in an accident, leaving her with a pistol, which he always carried with him for protection, and no savings. Yolanda's second marriage lasted only 3 years. Her husband left her for a younger woman. There were other men, but she was never truly happy with any of them, until Ebony. He made her feel desirable, beautiful, young. When they were together, the age difference seemed to evaporate. Yolanda knew it couldn't last forever, that one day he would find a girl his own age. But she didn't think it would be so soon. Ebony finished with the microwave and took up the old toaster. 2 hours later, he closed the shop and got into his shabby Ford, first to Lakeisha's, then to Yolanda's. Sometimes he thought this double life would drive him crazy, but he couldn't choose. Lakeisha was his future. Yolanda was his passion. Lakeisha Mayweather lived in a neat apartment building on the other side of Little Elm. She worked as a nurse at a local clinic and dreamed of becoming a doctor someday. Ebony had met her when he drove his mother to the hospital. Lakeisha was kind, caring, and undoubtedly in love with him. "Ebony!" Lakeisha opened the door before he could knock. Her face shone with happiness. "I was just calling the florist. They confirmed the order for the bouquets." Ebony kissed her on the cheek and walked into the small but cozy apartment. Wedding fashion magazines, sample invitations, and guest lists were spread out on the coffee table. "I can't believe it's only 3 days away." Lakeisha put her arms around his neck. "Are you nervous?" "A little," Ebony lied. In fact, he was terrified. Not at the thought of marrying Lakeisha, but at having to explain his absence to Yolanda during the week of their honeymoon. They spent the evening discussing the final details of the ceremony. Lakeisha had dreamed of a wedding since she was a child and had thought of every little detail. Ebony nodded and agreed, mentally already in a different place. "Are you sure your sister is coming?" Lakeisha asked when they were done with the plans. She hadn't even responded to the invitation. "Kima? Of course she's coming. She's just, busy with her own thing." In fact, Kima Darbo, Ebony's older sister, had been acting strangely for months now. It was as if she was avoiding him, and when they did meet, she looked at him with such disapproval, as if she knew something she shouldn't. Ebony was uncomfortable under her gaze, so he tried to keep his interactions with his sister to a minimum. At 7 o'clock that evening, Ebony was at Yolanda's. Her diner closed at 6, and she had dinner ready for him by the time he arrived. They ate in the kitchen, in a cramped apartment above the diner, which was accessed by an inconspicuous door at the back of the building. None of the visitors even knew the apartment existed, much less what went on in it after hours. "You seem tense today," Yolanda said, watching Ebony pick at his plate thoughtfully. "Is something wrong?" Yolanda's eyes, dark and deep, looked at him with concern. Age had left its marks on her face, wrinkles in the corners of her eyes, 2 deep creases from her nose to her lips. But to Ebony, she was still beautiful, the same woman who made his heart beat faster. "Just tired," he answered. "A lot of work." "You said you'd be busy this weekend." Yolanda refilled his tea. "What's this family business?" Ebony tensed. He had prepared for this question, but he still felt uncomfortable deceiving the woman who looked at him with such love. "My aunt is coming from Dallas. She wants me to show her around, take her to church. You know how old people are. Show them everything, tell them everything." Yolanda grinned. "I'm an old woman too, Ebony." "You?" He took her hand across the table. "You're not even in your prime. You're just beginning to live." It was their joke, their little way of sidestepping the uncomfortable subject of age. Yolanda shook her head, but smiled. She knew that Ebony lied to her sometimes, knew that sooner or later he would leave her for someone younger, but she hoped that time had not yet come. After dinner, they moved to the bedroom. Ebony was gentle and attentive as always. He knew every curve of her body, every sensitive spot. Yolanda closed her eyes, surrendering to the sensations. In these moments, she forgot her age, her wrinkles and gray hair. She was just a woman, loved and desired. As they lay side by side in the darkness, Yolanda pressed herself against him and whispered, "I love you, Ebony." He hugged her tighter but said nothing back. He had never said those words, not to her, not to Lakeisha. It was as if he was afraid that by saying them out loud, he was committing himself to some kind of promise. In the morning, Ebony woke early. Yolanda was still asleep. He dressed quietly and went out, leaving a note saying he had a lot of work to do and would drop by in the evening. It was a lie. He planned to spend all day today with Lakeisha, preparing everything for the wedding. On the way home, Ebony reflected on his situation. He didn't want to hurt either woman. Yolanda had given him what Lakeisha could never give him: unconditional acceptance, passion without commitment, love without expectations. Lakeisha, on the other hand, was his chance for a normal life, for a family, for a future. He knew he was doing the wrong thing by continuing his relationship with Yolanda when the wedding was just days away. But he couldn't bring himself to break up with her. After the honeymoon, he thought. I'll explain everything to her after the honeymoon. There was a surprise waiting for him at home, Sitting on the porch was Kima, his sister. Her face was serious, her eyebrows drawn up to the bridge of her nose, a sure sign of an impending conversation that Ebony would not like. "Where have you been all night?" she asked instead of greeting. "And don't tell me you've been working late. I called the workshop at 8 in the evening." Ebony sighed. "I'm a grown man, Kima. I don't have to answer to you. You're getting married in 3 days, Ebony. 3 days. And instead of being with your fiancé, you're out somewhere at night." Ebony walked around his sister and opened the door. "I have a lot to do. If you've come to read morals, you can leave." Kima followed him into the house. "I know about you and Yolanda." Ebony froze. His heart skipped a beat. "I don't know what you mean," he lied without looking at his sister. "Don't take me for a fool." Kima crossed her arms over her chest. "I've seen you leaving her diner at 6 in the morning more than once. What are you doing, Ebony? She's older than Mom." Ebony felt anger rising in him, not at his sister, but at himself, at the situation, at having to justify himself. "It's none of your business," he said, "and I'd appreciate it if you'd stay out of my life." "What about Lakeisha?" Kima wasn't going to back down. "She doesn't deserve this. You must tell her the truth before the wedding." Ebony shook his head. "There is no truth. Yolanda is my friend, my client. Nothing more." "Liar," Kima said quietly. "You're lying to everyone. Me, Lakeisha. Probably Yolanda too. It won't end well, Ebony." She turned and headed for the door. She stopped on the threshold. "I'll come to the wedding, for Lakeisha's sake. But if you don't stop this madness, I'll tell her myself." When the door closed behind her sister, Ebony slumped down on the couch and covered her face with her hands. Kima knew. Who else could have known? How long could he keep up this lie? The phone in his pocket vibrated. A message from Lakeisha. "Can't wait for Saturday. Love you." Ebony sighed and sent a reply. "Me too." Detective Jethro Sims stretched in his chair, feeling his vertebrae crunch. 58 years made themselves felt with a nagging ache in his lower back. He rubbed his eyes and stared at the computer screen again. Reports wouldn't write themselves, and there were already 5 pending petty theft cases on his desk. Nothing serious. Little Elm was a quiet town. Sometimes Jethro thought it was for the best. 23 years on the force, he'd seen a lot of things. Now that he was only 2 years away from retirement, he was glad for the routine. "Sims, you should go home," came Lieutenant Grover's voice as he peered into the office. It was almost 9 o'clock at night. Jethro nodded, not taking his eyes off the screen. "I'll finish a couple more reports, and then I'll be on my way." "You ought to be out fishing, not working on paperwork," Grover chuckled. "How's your retirement plan?" 2 boats, a lake house, and no criminals in sight." Jethro smiled weakly. When the lieutenant left, the detective plunged back into his work. The pension. Everyone around him was talking about it, as if in 2 years there would be nothing but fishing and sleeping on a chaise lounge. What if he's not ready? What if his whole life is a badge and a gun? No wife, divorced 15 years ago, no kids either, didn't work out, friends, had there ever been any? Jethro sighed and closed another report. Maybe Grover was right, and it was time for him to go home. To an empty apartment, to a cold dinner and a glass of whiskey before bed. Tomorrow would be a new day, new reports, new routine. Until someone comes up with the idea of disturbing Little Elm's peace with something more serious than stealing a bicycle. While Detective Sims pondered his fate, Kima Darbo was returning home after seeing her brother. Her thoughts were troubled. She had accidentally learned of Ebony's connection to Yolanda months ago when she had run into the diner for breakfast and saw her brother walking out of the back door in the early morning hours. At first, she thought she had imagined it, but then, noticing their looks and the way Yolanda furtively touched Ebony's arm, she realized everything. Kima was no prude. She understood that adults had the right to decide for themselves who they wanted to be with, but the situation with Lakeisha changed everything. Ebony was getting married in 3 days, and Lakeisha didn't deserve to be cheated like that. The phone in her bag rang. It was her friend Tanisha, who worked at the beauty parlor and knew all the Little Elm gossip. "Listen, have you picked out a dress for your brother's wedding yet?" Tanisha asked without preamble. "Yes, the blue one, you saw it," Kima sighed. "I'm not sure I'm going at all." "What do you mean you won't go? Everyone will be there. I'm doing the bride's hair this morning." She's so sweet. She talks about your brother all the time. Kima felt a pang of guilt. Lakeisha was really a good girl, hard-working, honest, loving. She deserved better than Ebony with his double life. I know she's nice, Kima said quietly. That's why it's hard for me. What do you mean? Tanisha could always sense when something was wrong. Kima, what's going on? Kima stopped at the street corner. She could have told Tanisha everything, that her brother was dating a woman who was old enough to be his grandmother, that he's cheating on his fiancée, that she didn't know what to do. Nothing, she said after a pause. I'm just tired. I'll see you at the wedding. When Kima hung up the phone, she had made a decision. She would go to the wedding, for Lakeisha's sake, and she would pray that Ebony would come to his senses and be a good husband. Meanwhile, in Lakeisha Mayweather's apartment, the pre-wedding rush was on. The bridesmaids were helping her try on the veil that had just been delivered from the bridal salon. The room was filled with laughter, excitement, and the scent of flowers sent by the groom. You will be the prettiest bride Little Elm has ever seen, exclaimed Janet, Lakeisha's best friend, as she helped attach the veil to her hair. Lakeisha looked at her reflection in the mirror and couldn't believe her happiness. She met Ebony at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. He brought his mother for a checkup and Lakeisha helped them with the paperwork. Ebony took her out for coffee to thank her for her help. One date turned into 2, then 3, and a year later he proposed. Did Ebony call? Janet asked, noticing Lakeisha glancing at the phone. No, not yet. He said he'd be busy with the best man tonight, trying on a suit and everything. She didn't want to show her concern. For the past few weeks, Ebony had seemed distant, as if his thoughts were somewhere far away. Lakeisha chalked it up to pre-wedding excitement, but sometimes doubt crept into her heart. I'm sure he'll call, Janet hugged her friend. Now let's decide which flowers will go with your hair. At that very moment, Ebony was not trying on a suit. He was sitting in his workshop, going over parts of a broken radio and thinking about his upcoming wedding. In 3 days, he would be Lakeisha's husband. The thought of it gave him a strange numbness. He loved Lakeisha, in his own way. She was kind, understanding, beautiful. With her, he could build a family, have children, grow old together. But then his thoughts inevitably returned to Yolanda, to her eyes, her smile, the way she looked at him, as if he were the center of the universe, to her hands that knew every inch of his body, to her strength and weakness at the same time, to the way she never demanded promises or vows from him, accepting what he could give. The phone rang, snapping Ebony out of his reverie. It was Lakeisha. Hello, darling. How's the fitting going? Her voice sounded happy and excited. Ebony swallowed. Everything's great. The suit is almost done. All that's left is to adjust the sleeves. I can't wait to see you in it, Lakeisha laughed. Janet says you'll look like a movie star. I hope I don't disappoint. Ebony tried to sound cheerful, but the words were hard to say. You never disappoint me, Lakeisha's voice softened. I love you, Ebony. And I you, he lied, closing his eyes. After talking to Lakeisha, Ebony felt even worse. He realized that he should end his relationship with Yolanda, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Just one last time, he thought. I'll see her one last time tonight before the wedding, and then that's it. He called Yolanda and told her he would stop by tonight. She was pleased as always, said she was waiting for him and that she would cook something special. Ebony felt he was drowning in a web of his own lies. Yolanda Broden closed the diner earlier than usual. Her last customer had left at 5 o'clock in the evening, and she decided not to wait for new ones. It was rare to see anyone after 5 on a weekday anyway. She began preparing dinner for Ebony, humming an old song from her youth. He seemed distant lately, and she wanted to please him with his favorite dishes. The pot of stew was already languishing on the stove when Yolanda remembered that she had forgotten to buy fresh herbs. She decided to make a quick run to the corner store. She threw on a light coat, the evenings in Little Elm were cool even in early summer, and went outside. On the way to the store, Yolanda saw a familiar car. Ebony's old Ford was parked outside a small flower store 2 blocks from her diner. Yolanda slowed her step. She didn't want to spy on him, but curiosity took over. She stepped closer and saw Ebony through the window. He was talking to a saleswoman, pointing to a bouquet of white lilies. Yolanda frowned. Ebony had never given her flowers. He always said they were a waste of money, that they wilted quickly anyway. Who were these lilies for, then? She retreated into the shadows of a neighboring building. As Ebony walked out of the store with the bouquet, he got in his car and drove away. But not toward the diner. Yolanda felt her heart clench with a bad feeling. She forgot about the greens and walked slowly back toward the diner, thinking about what she had seen. At home, she sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall. In recent weeks, Ebony had begun canceling meetings more often than usual. He talked about family matters, about work, about his aunt in Dallas. Yolanda didn't pay much attention to it after all. He had a life of his own. Now all these little things were adding up to a disturbing picture. The phone rang, making her flinch. It was Ebony. "Yolanda, I'm sorry. I can't make it today." His voice sounded guilty. "I had a sudden emergency." "What kind of business?" Yolanda tried to speak calmly, but inside everything was boiling with anger and fear. "A customer, with a refrigerator." Ebony was stammering, which wasn't like him. "I'll call tomorrow, okay?" Yolanda exhaled slowly. "Of course, darling. Good luck with the refrigerator." She hung up the phone and looked at the cooling pot of stew. Something wasn't right. Something was not right at all. The next day, Yolanda decided to follow Ebony. She had never done anything like this before, but anxiety gnawed at her from the inside. She closed the diner, telling the regular customers that she wasn't feeling well, and headed to Ebony's house. She parked her old Toyota on a nearby street and waited. An hour later, Ebony came out of the house, got into his car, and drove away. Yolanda followed him, keeping her distance. He stopped outside an apartment building on the other side of town. Yolanda parked across the street and watched. Ebony went up to the second floor and knocked on one of the doors. The door was opened by a young woman, beautiful, slender, with a radiant smile. She threw herself around Ebony's neck, and he put his arms around her, picking her up and whirling her around in the air. Then they walked into the apartment together, and the door closed. Yolanda sat in the car, feeling the ground go from under her feet. She knew that Ebony was younger than her, that sooner or later he would find someone his own age. She had been preparing for that day, but not like this. Not with deceit, not with lies, not with this sense of betrayal that was eating her up from the inside out. She sat in the car for 3 hours before Ebony left the apartment. In parting, the young woman hugged him again and said something that made him smile. Yolanda had seen that smile 1,000 times. Sincere, warm, meant only for her. Now it belonged to someone else. Yolanda returned home and spent a sleepless night remembering all 3 years of their relationship. Every word, every look, every promise. She remembered how Ebony had told her that age didn't matter, that he had never met a woman more beautiful than her. How he had sworn he would always be there for her. All those words now seemed like mockery. The next day she followed him again. This time Ebony had gone to church. Yolanda was surprised. He had never been religious. She parked nearby and saw him meeting with the pastor. They talked for a long time. Then Ebony showed something in the church room, as if planning an arrangement. Yolanda's heart clenched with a terrible suspicion. She waited until Ebony had left and approached the church. There were several leaves hanging on the bulletin board at the entrance. One caught her eye. Wedding of Ebony Darbo and Lakeisha Mayweather. Saturday, 11 o'clock in the morning. Yolanda felt her legs go under. She leaned against the wall to keep from falling. The wedding. Ebony was getting married. This Saturday. In 2 days. She made it to the car and sat there, unable to move until the sun began to set. Her mind raced with scraps of thoughts, memories, plans. She thought back to her difficult past, all the disappointments and betrayals she had endured, and thought that Ebony was different, that he had loved her truly. How naive she had been. When she returned home, Yolanda mechanically made herself some tea and sat down at the table. Her eyes fell on the photograph on the shelf, the only picture of her and Ebony together, taken at a picnic in the country where no one could see them. They looked happy. She looked young, almost like the girl Ebony was going to marry. Yolanda felt something breaking inside her. All these years she had believed that she had finally found happiness. That fate, after all her trials, had given her love. Now she realized that she had been nothing but a young man's entertainment. A convenient, undemanding lover, easy to get rid of when it was time to settle down. The phone rang, making her wince. Yolanda looked at the screen. Ebony. She didn't bother to answer it. A minute later, a message came through. "Hi, still planning on stopping by tomorrow night. Miss you." Yolanda threw the phone across the room. How dare he? How could he text her those words when he was going to marry someone else in 2 days? She spent a sleepless night immersed in memories and plans for revenge. By morning, her mind was clouded with fatigue and pain. She mechanically opened the diner, served the customers with a vacant stare, not noticing their concerned questions about her well-being. In the evening, Ebony did not come or call. Yolanda sat in the dark, staring at the door, waiting for the call that never came. That night, something finally broke in her soul. Saturday morning, Yolanda got up at first light. She showered, put on her best dress, a dark blue, long-sleeved one that Ebony said made her eyes look brighter. Then she opened the bedroom closet and pulled out a box from the bottom. In it was an old revolver, an inheritance from her second husband, a truck driver who always carried a gun for protection. Yolanda had never fired it before, but she knew how to do it. Her husband had taught her, just in case someone broke into the house while he was away. She checked the drum, 6 rounds in place. The revolver was heavy and cold in her hand. Yolanda put it in her bag and left the house. She didn't leave a note, didn't close the diner. None of that mattered anymore. A small crowd had gathered outside the church, guests in smart suits and dresses, with flowers and gifts. Yolanda stayed in the car, watching what was happening. She saw the bride arrive in her white dress, her bridesmaids greeting her with enthusiastic cheers. She saw Ebony nervously adjusting his tie before entering the church, how he smiled and accepted congratulations, how no one even suspected the life he had led with her for the past 3 years. As everyone went inside, Yolanda stepped out of the car. Her feet moved as if on their own, carrying her to the church doors. She could hear the pastor giving a solemn speech, the soft music playing. The revolver in her bag seemed to urge her to take it, to end this farce, this lie. Yolanda stopped at the entrance, listening. The pastor was asking if Ebony Darbo would agree to take Lakeisha Mayweather to be his lawfully wedded wife. Yolanda heard his voice, the same voice that had whispered words of love to her. "I agree." Something shattered inside her. It was like the last thread that connected her to reality. Yolanda took the revolver out of her bag and pushed open the church door. She saw them standing in front of the altar, Ebony in a black suit, and Lakeisha in a white dress. She saw the shocked faces of the guests turning toward her, saw Ebony's eyes widen when he recognized her. "Yolanda," was all he had time to say before she raised her revolver and pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot rolled through the church, overpowering the screams of the guests. Ebony grabbed his chest and fell to his knees. Lakeisha screamed, rushing to him. Yolanda stood looking at the work of her hands, feeling a strange desolation. Then, as if awakening from a trance, she turned and rushed toward the exit, clutching the revolver in her trembling hand. Detective Jethro Sims arrived at the church as the wail of ambulance sirens was already breaking the silence of Little Elm's Saturday morning. He parked his car away from the bustle and got out slowly, putting on his shabby jacket. The sun was beating down on his eyes, making him squint and increasing his headache from lack of sleep. Jethro hated Saturday shifts, especially. They reminded him that other people had lives outside of work. "What do we got?" he asked the young officer who had blocked the entrance to the church with yellow crime scene tape. "A shooting during a wedding ceremony, sir. A woman walked in and shot the groom. She fled before we arrived. The victim was taken to the hospital, condition critical." Jethro nodded and went inside. The church was a spectacle of chaos and dashed hopes. The white flowers and ribbons that adorned the aisle between the pews had been trampled in the panic. A dark stain of blood could be seen on the floor by the altar. Several officers were already at work, interviewing witnesses and gathering evidence. Detective Sims, Officer Parker, a sergeant with 12 years of experience, walked up to him, holding a notepad. "Victim is Ebony Darbo, 29 years old, appliance repairman. The shooter is believed to be Yolanda Broden, 65, owner of Yolanda's Diner on Maple Street. Witnesses say she entered the church as the vows were being exchanged, fired once and fled. The bullet hit Darbo in the chest, but grazed his ribs, which may have saved his life. Jethro looked around. On one of the benches sat a young woman in a blood-stained wedding dress. Her friends surrounded her, trying to comfort her, but she seemed oblivious to them, staring straight ahead with glazed eyes. "The bride?" Jethro asked. "Yes, Lakeisha Mayweather, 24 years old, a nurse at St. Mary's. She's still in shock, but the doctor has examined her. Physically, she's fine." Jethro walked over to Lakeisha and squatted down next to her so he was at her eye level. "Minus Ms. Mayweather, I'm Detective Jethro Sims. I realize you've been through a terrible shock, but I need to ask you some questions. Do you know the woman who shot your fiancé?" Lakeisha slowly shifted her gaze to the detective. Her eyes were red with tears, but dry as if she'd already cried all the tears she had. "No," her voice sounded hoarse. "I've never seen her before. She just walked in and—" Lakeisha fell silent, unable to continue. "Have you noticed anything unusual in your fiancé's behavior lately? Anything that might explain why this woman wanted to hurt him?" Lakeisha shook her head. Ebony was ordinary, maybe a little distracted because of the wedding preparations, but he never spoke of any Yolanda. Jethro nodded and straightened up. He beckoned to Officer Parker. "Take Ms. Mayweather home and have someone close to her stay with her. We'll continue this conversation later when she's better." He then turned to another officer. "Get me all the information on Yolanda Broden. Address, phone number, relatives, friends, anything that can help us find her, and have someone go to her diner, see if she's back there." While the officers carried out his instructions, Jethro scrutinized the crime scene. He picked up a cartridge case from the floor, an old revolver, by the looks of it. Then he noticed a small purse on the floor by the altar. The shooter must have dropped it in her haste. Inside were keys, a wallet with Yolanda Broden's driver's license, and lipstick. No clues as to where she might have gone. Jethro finished his examination and drove to the hospital. The emergency room was noisy as news of the church shooting had spread quickly through the small town, and many people had come to inquire about the victim's condition. "I'm in charge of this case." Jethro showed his badge to the nurse on duty. "What's the status on Ebony Darbo?" "He's in surgery. Bullet grazed his lung, but luckily not his heart. Dr. Chen said his chances are good if there are no complications." "When can I talk to him?" "Not until tomorrow morning at the earliest, and that's if everything goes well." Jethro nodded and left his card. "Call me as soon as he regains consciousness." Back at the station, the detective sat down at the computer and opened the database. Yolanda Broden, 65, widow, no criminal record, not even a parking ticket. Owner of Yolanda's Diner for the last 30 years, no apparent ties to Ebony Darbo. The phone on the desk rang. It was the officer sent to the diner. "Detective, the diner's closed. Neighbors say they haven't seen Broden since this morning. But I found something interesting in the trash can at the diner, a torn picture of Darbo and some love letters." "Bring it down to the station," Jethro ordered, feeling the pieces of the puzzle begin to fit together. An hour later, he had a scrap of Scotch tape on his desk, a photograph of Yolanda and Ebony embracing in the woods, looking happy and in love, and a few notes written in a man's handwriting. "Miss you. Can't wait for tonight. You're the most beautiful woman I've ever met." No signatures, but Jethro was willing to bet the author was Ebony Darbo. "A love affair," he muttered to himself. That was it. His musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. The young woman he had seen in the church among the guests stood on the threshold. "Detective Sims? I'm Kima Darbo, Sister Ebony. I was told you were in charge of the investigation." Jethro gestured for her to come in and sit down. Kima looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, trembling hands. "How's your brother?" the detective asked. "Still in surgery. The doctors say his chances are good." Kima swallowed. "I'm here because I know something that might help with the investigation." Jethro pulled out a notebook and a pen. "I'm listening." "Ebony and Yolanda, they were together. For 3 years now," Kima said softly, as if confessing her own sin. "I found out a few months ago. I saw him leaving her diner early in the morning, talked to him, but he denied it, said she was just a customer." Did you tell the fiancé about this? Jethro asked, taking notes. Kima shook her head. I tried to drop a hint, but I couldn't. Lakeisha was so in love with him, so looking forward to the wedding. I had hoped Ebony would come to his senses and end this relationship before marriage. Do you know where Yolanda might be hiding? She has almost no friends. She's always been withdrawn. But, Kima wondered. Ebony once mentioned someone named Ruta, an old friend of Yolanda's who lives in the country. That's all I know. Jethro thanked Kima for the information and asked her to stay in touch. After she left, he contacted Officer Parker. Check anyone Yolanda Broden knows named Ruta or similar, especially those who live outside the city limits. By evening they had a name, Rhoda Jackson, a 69-year-old widow living in a small house 5 miles outside Little Elm. Jethro personally went there, accompanied by 2 officers. Ruta's cabin stood on a side road, surrounded by old oak trees. There was a light in the windows when they arrived. Jethro knocked on the door with his hand on his holster, purely on instinct, though he did not expect resistance. The door was opened by an older woman with a wary look in her eyes. What can I do for you? Mrs. Jackson? I'm Detective Jethro Sims. We're looking for Yolanda Broden in connection with an incident that occurred this morning. Ruta paused, then stepped aside. She's here, in the bedroom. I didn't know she'd hurt anyone until I saw the news. She came in such a state. I couldn't get her out. Jethro entered the house while the officers remained outside. He walked to the designated room and saw Yolanda sitting on the edge of the bed. She looked utterly devastated, her eyes staring into nothing, her hands resting on her lap. She was still wearing the dark blue dress she'd come to church in. Yolanda Broden? Jethro spoke softly, as if to a frightened child. I'm Detective Jethro Sims. You are under arrest on suspicion of the attempted murder of Ebony Darbo. Yolanda slowly raised her head and looked at him. There was no fear or remorse in her eyes, just endless fatigue. Is he alive? She asked faintly. Yes. The operation is still in progress, but the doctors say he has a good chance. A lone tear rolled down Yolanda's cheek. I didn't want to kill him. I just wanted him to feel the same pain I did. Jethro cuffed her and read her rights. Yolanda did not resist. She allowed herself to be led out of the house and put into the police car. All the way to the station, she remained silent, staring out the window with an unseeing stare. In the interrogation room, Jethro offered her water and turned on the tape. Tell me what happened, Yolanda, he asked, sitting down across from her. From the beginning. Yolanda took a sip of water and began to speak, slowly, as if each word hurt her. We met 3 years ago. He came to fix the oven in my diner. He was so attentive, kind. No one had looked at me like I meant something in a long time. She talked about how their relationship had evolved, how they spent every evening together, how he'd told her age didn't matter, how she felt alive for the first time in years. And then I noticed that he started to drift away, canceling appointments, making excuses. I followed him. It's wrong, I know, but I had to know. And I saw her, young, beautiful, like I'll never be again. Jethro listened without interrupting. The story was as old as the world. Love triangle, jealousy, betrayal. And yet there was something particularly tragic about it. I found out about the wedding 2 days ago. I saw the announcement in the church. Yolanda clenched her fists. He didn't even have the courage to tell me. He was going to marry her and keep seeing me, like I was some kind of spare part for his life. And you decided to end it, Jethro said quietly. I haven't slept in 2 nights, thinking and thinking, remembering every word he said, every promise he made. And then Saturday morning came and I just broke. I took out the gun my husband left me, drove to the church. I didn't even plan to shoot. I just wanted to see his face when he realized I knew the truth. She was silent, staring into the space in front of her. What happened at the church? Jethro nudged her gently. I heard him say, I do. In his normal voice, like it meant nothing. Like he hadn't told me 1,000 times he'd never marry, that he only wanted me. And something inside me just clicked. Yolanda looked at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. I don't remember pulling the gun. I don't remember pulling the trigger. I only remember his eyes when he saw me, scared guilty. Jethro finished his interrogation and turned off the tape. Yolanda was taken to a holding cell, pending formal charges. She walked as if in a dream, not resisting, not asking questions. The next morning, Jethro received a call from the hospital. Ebony Darbo had regained consciousness after surgery. His condition had stabilized, and the doctors had allowed a brief interrogation. Jethro found Ebony in the intensive care unit. The young man was pale, with tubes connected to his body, but conscious. "Minus Mr. Darbo, I'm Detective Jethro Sims. How do you feel?" "Like I've been shot." Ebony grinned weakly. "Lakeisha, was she here?" "No, Neptu. I think she needs time." Ebony closed his eyes. "Yolanda? We found her. She confessed to the shooting." "It's my fault," Ebony whispered. "I should have told her the truth. I should have ended it before the wedding. I just couldn't choose. Couldn't let either of them go." "Did you love her?" Jethro asked, not knowing exactly who he was asking. "Both of them. In different ways." Ebony looked exhausted, physically as well as mentally. "Yolanda was freedom. No expectations, no obligations. She accepted me for who I was. Lakeisha was the future. Family, stability, everything you're supposed to have at my age. And you decided you could have both." "I was an idiot." Ebony closed his eyes again. "What will happen to Yolanda now? That is for the court to decide. But given your relationship and her clean past, she'll likely be charged with attempted aggravated murder. If you press charges—" "I won't," Ebony said firmly. "I'm the one who should be in jail, not her." Jethro nodded and stood up. "Rest, Mr. Darbo. We'll talk again." Leaving the hospital, the detective drove to the station. He had to finish his report and prepare materials for the prosecutor. On the way, he thought about what he'd heard from Yolanda and Ebony, about a love that had turned into an obsession, about the choice that was never made, about the gunshot that had ruined 3 lives. At the station, Jethro saw Lakeisha Mayweather sitting in the hallway. She was no longer in her wedding dress, but simple jeans and a t-shirt. Her eyes were still red from crying, but her gaze had become determined. "Detective, I was told you arrested the woman who shot Ebony." "Yes, Yolanda Broden. I want to talk to her." Jethro raised his eyebrows in surprise. "I'm not sure that's a good idea, Ms. Mayweather. Please." Lakeisha stood up. "I need to know, need to understand." After some hesitation, Jethro agreed. He escorted Lakeisha to the visiting room and brought Yolanda there. The 2 women sat down across from each other. Jethro remained standing at the door, ready to intervene if necessary. "Did you love him?" Lakeisha asked without preamble. Yolanda nodded. "More than anything." "So did I." They looked at each other for a long time, the young woman with broken dreams and the older woman with a broken heart. Then Lakeisha stood up and, without another word, left the room. Jethro took Yolanda back to her cell, then went back to his office and sat down to report. The story he was recording was as old as the world. Love that had turned into obsession. Jealousy that blinded the mind. A gunshot that would echo through the lives of everyone involved in the drama for a long time to come. Finishing his report, Jethro leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He thought about his life, about his divorce 15 years ago, about the woman he had once loved to the point of madness, about the choices he'd never made, about a love that could build or destroy with equal force. Maybe that's the point, he thought, in finding the line between love and obsession, and not to cross it.